The dust storm arrived with ruthless intensity, engulfing the horizon in a suffocating shroud of ashen gray. In the solitude of her fading farm, Eloise McCarty was startled by the urgent knock of strangers at her door. Cowboys adrift in the tempest, famished, shattered, and overlooked by the world. Though she struggled to nourish her own body, she managed to gather sustenance for them. She believed they would vanish with the breeze instead. 2 days later, a procession of riders emerged at the boundary of her land, bearing a debt of gratitude that no tempest could ever wash away. The wind carried a sound that night, a deep, growling moan, reminiscent of something wounded and furious, dragging itself across the vast plains. Eloise McCarty stood on the sagging porch of her farm, one hand clutching the weathered wooden post, her skirts billowing around her legs. She recognized that sound. All who had weathered the previous tempests did. The air was filled with the roar of a dust storm, fierce enough to ravage the land, powerful enough to entomb aspirations under countless suffocating layers of soil. The horizon had vanished. The sun, once a fiery disk suspended over the meadows, had vanished behind a billowing curtain of ashen clouds. The cattle stirred uneasily, their mournful lowing echoing with a sense of urgency and despair. Eloise cast her gaze upward, uttered a silent prayer, and drew her shawl closer around her shoulders. She found herself alone, without a man to assist her in this moment. There were no neighbors willing to extend a helping hand. It was just her and the land, yet even the very earth seemed to conspire against her. Just as she was on the verge of stepping back inside, a sound caught her attention, a cry barely heard amidst the fierce wail of the wind. Next, yet another. From the shadows, forms took shape, unsteady silhouettes adorned with hats drawn low and scarves wrapped tightly around their features. Wranglers of the wild frontier. There are 3 of them, unknown souls. Eloise felt a sudden jolt in her heart. In this corner of the world, a rap on the door after dusk often signaled impending trouble. Yet these men bore no resemblance to raiders or thieves. They advanced as if tethered to the brink, as if the tempest sought to engulf them entirely. A broad-shouldered man, marked by a limp, ascended the steps and lowered his scarf. His visage was shrouded in a layer of dust. His lips bore the marks of desiccation, and his eyes were tinged with a crimson hue. "Ma'am," he croaked, tipping his hat with a subtle flourish. We seek no conflict, merely a place to rest if you would permit it." Eloise paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Every fiber of my being urged me to tread carefully. She kept a shotgun behind the door, yet what protection could it offer against 3 formidable men if their thoughts veered into darkness? And yet an essence in their expressions, something both weary and profoundly human, touched her deeply. With a single nod, she widened the door's embrace. The aroma within the farmhouse was a comforting blend of wood smoke and the lingering scent of aged bread. The men shook the dust from their boots and lifted their hats from their heads. They moved with a deliberate slowness, as if honoring something sacred. They lingered by the door, as though fearful that their shattered selves might taint the sanctity of the room. Eloise glided into the kitchen, her hands seemingly possessed by an unseen force. A touch of cornmeal, a touch of bacon fat. She gathered the remnants of her supplies, crafting a coarse skillet of cornbread and warming water for coffee so feeble it was nearly transparent. While she toiled, her eyes flickered toward them. 2 of the men whispered their gratitude, fatigue weighing heavily upon their shoulders, subdued. Yet the 3rd one, the most silent, lingered in solitude. He stood tall, a scar tracing a path from the corner of his eyebrow to the edge of his cheek. His coat bore the marks of time, patched in places, while his boots had been worn down to the very sole. Yet he bore an unsettling calmness that disturbed her more than any armament could. He remained silent. He refrained from taking a seat. He merely observed her with those pale, inscrutable eyes. As she placed the food upon the table, the 2 loquacious souls eagerly dove in, their quiet groans of gratitude filling the air. The quiet figure lingered, biding his time until she offered a subtle nod. Then, with deliberate care, he grasped a piece of cornbread, breaking it with a slow, almost ritualistic precision. They dined in a hushed atmosphere, interrupted only by the tempest raging against the windows and the sporadic clatter of tin cups. By the table, the 2 men exchanged murmured apologies before settling into cozy corners by the hearth for the night. The quiet figure stood motionless, gazing into the flickering flames, ensnared in a realm that Eloise could not penetrate. She lingered in her gaze for a heartbeat more, then retrieved a frayed blanket from the chest against the wall and draped it over the edge of the table. "This is for you," she murmured softly. The man's head inclined ever so slightly, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, yet his lips remained sealed. Yet, as she pivoted, the gentle whisper of the blanket being stirred reached her ears. As the wind howled fiercely against the walls and dust infiltrated every crevice, Eloise found herself wide awake in her cramped bed that night. The house was a paradox, brimming with presence yet echoing with absence simultaneously. She had offered refuge to those unknown, nourishing them with provisions she could scarcely afford. And somehow, deep within her very essence, she sensed that this night was far from the conclusion. A change had occurred, borne upon the whisper of the tempest. She remained uncertain, caught in the delicate balance between salvation and ruin. The morning unfolded with a languid weight, enveloped in a thick mist. In the aftermath of the storm, red light spilled across the battered fields, a haunting reminder of the scars it had left behind. Clouds of dust rising to a man's knee, scattered branches strewn across the yard, and a silence so profound it seemed to hold a reverence of its own. Eloise awoke from a fitful slumber. For an instant, she lost herself to the confines of her fragile sanctuary, momentarily shedding the burden that constantly pressed upon her heart. Then the subtle scent of dust and sweat brought to mind the strangers. She rose quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and padded barefoot to the main room. The two loquacious cowboys had departed. By the hearth, their bedrolls lay neatly folded, a small stack of coins resting atop them, perhaps payment, or merely a gesture of gratitude. Eloise gazed at the coins for an extended moment, their metallic sheen appearing almost alien in her humble abode. Only a solitary figure lingered, the quiet one. He lingered by the window, his sturdy silhouette etched against the feeble morning glow. His hat sat low on his brow, yet she discerned the tension etched in his jawline. His hand flexed at his side as if preparing for a strike that would never arrive. Eloise gently cleared her throat. "The coffee has lost its warmth, yet you are still invited to partake." He inclined his head ever so slightly, a subtle nod of acknowledgement. Yet, silence remains. She occupied herself at the stove, warming the remnants of yesterday's concoction. Her hands quivered ever so slightly. Negative, from fear, yet from something more elusive to define. This man disturbed her peace, not due to any sense of danger, but rather an unsettling familiarity, as if he bore the weight of existence, marked by its trials and tribulations. As she set the cup down on the table, he moved closer, accepting it with a soft murmur that could have been a thank you, yet was lost amidst the groaning of the floorboards. They lingered in quietude, the delicate walls inhaling and exhaling alongside the breeze. At last, she discovered her voice. "Do you have a name?" He paused as though contemplating the peril of his response. Then, in a voice as coarse as gravel, he uttered, "Calder." Simply that, devoid of a surname, lacking any explanation. Eloise inclined her head with a measured deliberation. Calder, a name that resonates with strength. A man shaped by the very tempests he journeyed across. Quiet, unyielding, and beyond the grasp of foresight. "Are you making plans? Shall we venture out today?" she inquired, maintaining a playful tone. Calder's eyes, cold and keen like the frost of winter, darted toward the door. Beyond it, the world remained shrouded in dust. The roads would lie in a state of disrepair, while towns would shutter their doors, sealing themselves away from the outside world. "There is no promising direction ahead," he stated plainly. Eloise nodded once more, yet an unsettling knot twisted within her stomach. Uncertainty washed over her, leaving her caught between relief and fear. She toiled throughout the day on the scant patch of earth available to her, her boots stirring up dust where lush grass had once thrived. Calder offered his assistance unbidden, mending a fractured fence and transporting water from the well. He remained silent unless the moment called for words, yet his presence was steadfast and unobtrusive, akin to a boulder steadfastly anchored in a tumultuous river. That evening they gathered once more by the hearth, cradling cups of weak coffee and gazing into the flickering flames. Eloise discovered that her words flowed more freely than she had intended. Details of the farm lingered in her mind, memories of how her husband had perished in a valiant attempt to rescue the cattle during a tempest reminiscent of the one that had just passed. She was unaware of the reason behind her words. Perhaps it was the stillness, Perhaps it was the manner in which Calder engaged, truly engaged, devoid of judgment, devoid of pity. "My neighbors," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "they believe I ought to have departed alongside him, that I am merely unyielding, absurd." Calder adjusted his position, the sound of his boots rasping against the floor echoing in the stillness. "You are not foolish," he remarked. "You find yourself in a standing position. That exceeds what many have." The words were unadorned, coarse. Yet for Eloise, they struck like a detonating force upon injuries she had not known were still seeping. She gazed at him, her eyes tracing the deep lines etched into his face, the scar that disfigured. On one side of it she pondered, not for the first time, the storms he had weathered and whether some still pursued him. Yet she refrained from inquiring. Certain burdens are not intended for sharing, not at this moment. As she settled into bed later that night, she found herself wide awake, her gaze fixed on the ceiling above. Outside, the wind had stilled, yet another tempest was gathering on the horizon, one that awakened not the dust, but the soul. And within the depths of her chest, where sorrow had taken residence, an unfamiliar sensation began to awaken, something perilously near to hope. The dawn unfurled its light across a realm shrouded in stillness. The tempest had drained the landscape of its vibrancy, reducing it to the fragile yellows and subdued browns of an expiring season. Eloise lingered by the kitchen window, her fingers encircling a worn mug, gazing out at the vast emptiness that unfurled toward the horizon. The two other cowboys had departed with the dawn's first light. She listened to the creaking of saddles, the soft clop of hooves echoing in the distance. As she gazed through the delicate lace curtain, she saw them already departing, mere silhouettes consumed by the swirling dust. A peculiar ache settled within her as she observed their departure, a solitude intensified by the fleeting, delicate companionship they had provided. Yet Calder remained still. He lingered on the porch, a substantial silhouette cast by the delicate morning sun, skillfully whittling a piece of wood with a knife that gleamed like silver in the soft light. The gentle scrape of steel upon wood was the sole sound that lingered in the air between them. Eloise drained the last sip of her coffee, placing the mug down with a sharper click than she had meant, and nudged the door open. "Are you considering sticking around?" she inquired, her arms crossed defiantly. Calder lifted his gaze from the carving, his eyes sharp and unwavering. He stated plainly that there was no call to leave just yet. Eloise arched an eyebrow. "You are not bound by any obligation. I provided for you, and that is sufficient." He shrugged, a subtle movement of his shoulders that seemed to embody the burden of a man unanchored, adrift without connections or a destination. "The storm has yet to reveal its true intentions," he remarked. "It's wise to approach with eyes wide open." It was a response grounded in practicality, a response that embraced safety. Yet Eloise felt an undercurrent, an unvoiced truth, akin to a river flowing silently beneath the parched soil. She gave a single nod, acknowledging it. In reality, she found solace in the presence of others. Not quite. The farm lay in a hushed stillness, its silence stretching on far too long. The void left by her husband's absence had drained the life from the house, while the murmurs of the town wrapped around her, deepening her solitude. A solitary figure perched silently on her porch posed no greater threat than the phantoms that haunted her existence. As the days drifted past, they toiled together, mending fences, clearing away the remnants of chaos, and caring for the few animals that had weathered the storm's fury. Calder spoke sparingly, while Eloise offered even fewer words. Yet a rhythm emerged between them, a quiet understanding forged from necessity and an elusive essence, something more challenging to define. As darkness enveloped the world, they gathered around the flickering flames of the fire. Calder meticulously whittled or polished his weathered saddle gear, while Eloise tended to frayed garments or gazed into the flickering flames, allowing the warmth to melt away the icy remnants of her heart she believed were lost forever. At times, as the fire crackled or the wind sighed, she would glimpse Calder observing her through the gaps, his gaze unwavering. It was not the look of a man appraising a woman, nor one assessing frailty, but rather that of a man who perceived a strength he comprehended all too well. Yet he never ventured beyond the unseen boundary that separated them, never sought to disrupt the stillness with empty chatter, and for that, Eloise felt a quiet sense of gratitude. On the fourth night, she discovered herself uttering words unbidden. "My husband." she murmured, her voice gravelly. He perished in his attempt to rescue a single steer, unable to endure the thought of its solitary demise. Calder remained silent, yet he placed his knife down, directing his complete and weighty focus upon her. They placed the blame on me. She kept her gaze fixed on her hands. He mentioned that had I not pleaded with him to remain on the farm, he might have ventured into town, seeking employment in a place deemed safer. The flames danced and whispered in the space that separated them. Calder leaned in, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice a quiet yet unwavering murmur as he finally began to speak. Individuals often seek a target for their blame, as it simplifies the pain, rendering it more manageable. Eloise locked eyes with him then, and in that instant, she understood. This man bore the weight of blame for transgressions that were not his own, shouldering a guilt that he had not rightfully acquired. She gulped, her throat constricted. "You're familiar with that, aren't you?" A fleeting glimmer of emotion, pain, perhaps regret, crossed Calder's gaze, yet he merely inclined his head, a quick, nearly imperceptible movement. They uttered no further words that night. Yet, an undeniable change occurred between them, as palpable and substantial as the dust that lingered, settled against the walls. The following morning dawned with a chill sharper than its predecessors, a fierce wind coursing through the desolate fields and shaking the windows in their casements. The sky stretched above, a washed-out hue, glaringly bright and achingly vacant, the type of sky that rendered a spirit insignificant. Eloise stirred from her slumber at dawn, propelled by routine rather than intention. There was perpetually a task at hand, even when the earth had scant offerings remaining. She discovered Calder already outside, tending to a broken gate with deliberate, measured motions. His presence was unwavering, a solid rock set against the relentless current of solitude that sought to drag her beneath the surface. They toiled together through the morning, sharing few words yet countless glances, fleeting moments of comprehension that required no elaboration. As the clock approached noon, Calder prepared his horse for the ride ahead. Eloise observed from the porch, a void beginning to take shape within her chest. She had not requested his presence to linger. He had made no promises. She reminded herself that she had no claim to desire anything beyond what a man, whose existence was shaped by isolation, could offer. He adjusted the stirrups, checked the reins, and swung into the saddle with a fluidity that hinted at countless hours spent traversing landscapes far beyond the ordinary. I would dare. She imagined he would gallop away in silence, much like untamed creatures slipping into the embrace of the forest. Calder halted at the boundary of the yard, feeling the restless movement of his horse beneath him. He tipped the brim of his hat, a quiet gesture of goodbye, before guiding his horse onto the path ahead. Eloise lingered in that spot, her gaze fixed on the swirling dust long after he had vanished from sight. The house seemed to echo with an even greater sense of emptiness than it had before, not due to his frequent words or the clamor he created, but rather because he infused the quiet moments with a comforting warmth. It was a revelation, an absence she had never acknowledged until it slipped away from her grasp. The following day unfolded with the weight of a lingering, distressing discomfort. Eloise followed her familiar routine as she always did. She repaired what was within her reach, patched up the rest, and endeavored to keep hope from taking root in the fissures of her heart. Hope lingered like a perilous shadow in this desolate expanse. It flourished effortlessly, yet it faded swiftly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a fragile stillness enveloped the scene. Isolation had woven itself deep within her very being. She consumed a delicate stew in solitude at the kitchen table, her gaze fixed on the vacant chair opposite her, convincing herself that this was for the best. As she stood at the sink, scrubbing the dishes, a low, distant rumble reached her ears. She stood still, the fractured plate slipping through her fingers. The sound intensified, a profound rhythmic rumble that signaled something other than the storm's resurgence. With her heart racing, she hurried to the porch. Initially, her gaze was drawn to the swirling dust on the horizon, but soon figures began to emerge from the haze. Obsidian shadows loom over the fading light. Illumination, equestrians, a multitude, perhaps even more, stretched out in a languid, unhurried line along the road that wound its way to her farm. In a dreadful instant, a wave of panic engulfed her. Could this have been a raiding party of sorts? Had Calder unwittingly invited trouble to her doorstep? Her fingers clutched the edge of the porch rail, turning her knuckles a stark white. As the riders approached, she discerned their features, Men clad in worn hats perched atop their heads, clothes worn and dust-laden, horses lean yet resolute, and at the forefront, guiding them with an unwavering, silent gravity, stood Calder. He rode with the confidence of a man returning to a destination of his own choosing, rather than one he had accidentally discovered. Behind him, the riders bore their burdens, bundles draped across their saddles, sacks of grain, tools, lumber, barrels of water, crates of food, an array of supplies. They were not a raiding party, they were a salvation. Eloise covered her mouth with a hand, her knees quaking beneath her, to yield. The gentlemen approached the porch, doffing their hats in a gesture of respect. Calder stepped down with measured grace, making his way toward the steps, the dust dancing around his boots. He remained expressionless. He remained silent. He placed a hefty burlap sack at her feet, its fragrance hinting at the blooms within, and offered a solitary grave nod. Eloise gazed at him, her words trapped in her throat. "What is the reason behind this?" she murmured, the inquiry slipping out before she could rein it in. Calder's voice emerged, gravelly and worn, as he finally responded. "The storm claimed what was once yours. Our goal is to contribute positively." The other men commenced unloading, their supplies moving swiftly and with precision. Gratitude was never a request. Payment was the last thing anyone anticipated. Eloise remained motionless, the weight of it enveloping her more forcefully than any tempest of dust ever had. A gesture of goodwill offered freely, without the desire for anything in return. And now, kindness blossomed in abundance, returning 100-fold. The wind swirled around them, yet this time it bore no omen of sorrow. It signaled the dawn of a fresh beginning, a notion she had not permitted herself to embrace for what felt like an eternity, anticipation. The farm, once a realm of whispers and fragile stillness, now thrummed with vitality. The rhythmic sound of hammers striking wood echoed through the air, the steady sound of shovels against the earth, accompanied by the soft whispers of conversation. All intertwined into a melody that Eloise had not known she longed for. The riders, these weathered souls who seemed to have been hewn from the very essence of the frontier, advanced with a silent determination. They mended the fractured fences, bolstered the drooping barn, and even sealed the gaps in the farmhouse roof where the recent storm had allowed the stars to shine through. No inquiries were made. They refrained from weaving tales. They diligently toiled away. It was as though Eloise's modest gesture amidst the tempest had woven an unseen bond among them, tethering them to her in a manner more profound than any formal agreement could achieve. Calder managed much of it, his voice dropping to hushed tones when necessary, yet otherwise maintaining his characteristic silence. He embodied strength without the need for control, a guiding presence without the title. Eloise navigated through the crowd, her heart constricted by a tumult of emotions. A swirl of gratitude intertwined with disbelief, accompanied by a lingering fear that everything might collapse if she leaned on it too heavily. She transported water to the men, preparing the scant provisions that remained in the pantry. As the supplies dwindled, a few of the riders began to unveil sacks filled with beans, rice, and even salt pork from the depths of their saddlebags. They gathered around a makeshift fire near the barn, laughter punctuating the air like fleeting rays of sunlight piercing through dense clouds. Yet, amidst the warmth, Eloise sensed the burden of gazes, not from the riders, but from the land that lay beyond. She caught fleeting glimpses of it, curtains fluttering in far-off farmhouses, silhouettes lingering on the ridge as dusk settled in. The eyes of the town were upon her, scrutinizing and assessing every move. In this unforgiving terrain, it was anticipated that a solitary woman would endure her trials in silence, rather than summon a multitude of unfamiliar faces into her dwelling. Soft murmurs would linger in the air. They consistently did. As the final nail was driven home and the last touches of repair were completed, Calder made his way to her on the porch. The stars stretched across the sky, radiant and distant, while the breeze wafted the aroma of newly tilled soil. Eloise wrapped her shawl more securely around her shoulders, her heart racing as Calder paused just a few feet away, hat in hand. "You saved us," he said simply, his voice low and rough. "Men such as ourselves, we carry that memory with us always." Eloise shook her head, grappling with the elusive nature of her voice. "I merely acted in accordance with what any honorable person would choose to do." Calder's gaze, ethereal and intense, locked onto hers. Indeed, ma'am, respectable individuals have previously denied us entry. You did not. The words hung in the air, weighty and sincere. Eloise averted her gaze, her eyelids fluttering as she fought against the prickling sensation in her eyes. She had never quite acclimated to the sensation of being truly observed, not in any meaningful way. Not since that fateful day when the town chose to turn its back on her, casting blame for her survival while her husband had not returned. "Don't expect the town to take kindly to it," she said, her smile strained and fragile. "They might claim I've lost my senses, or even something more severe." Calder's lips formed a gentle arc, resembling a smile, yet remaining just shy of full expression. "The town has erred in the past." In that moment he extended to her not the shield of protection, nor the weight of promises, but rather a profound sense of solidarity. Recognizing that her defiance against the current was not an act of folly, but rather a testament to her courage, the riders lingered for an additional night. As the first light of dawn broke, they gathered their equipment, secured the saddles, and climbed onto their mounts. One by one, they tipped their hats to Eloise, some offering soft murmurs of gratitude, while others merely nodded as they ventured into the pale morning light. Calder was the final one to depart. He lingered at the edge of the yard, his hat pulled low over his eyes, the horse shifting restlessly beneath him. Eloise stepped off the porch, the cold morning air biting at her skin. "Will you return?" she inquired, astonishing even herself with the query. Calder remained silent for an extended moment. Then, with a deliberate weight that felt intrinsic to his very being, he nodded once. "When the moment arrives," he remarked. With that, he pivoted and galloped after the rest, vanishing into the boundless expanse of terrain. Eloise observed until he became merely a silhouette against the dawn, her heart brimming with a fullness it had not known in years. The dust may still cling to the earth, and the whispers may still swirl like storms poised to unleash their fury, yet an undeniable shift had occurred. Hope had established its presence here, and it would not be easily dislodged. The days that followed the departure of the riders felt more acute, as if the air itself had taken on a cutting quality. Eloise approached her tasks with a renewed vigor, diligently repairing the fence lines alongside the men. She had fortified herself, planting seeds in the unyielding soil, sweeping the dust from her floors with a gentler touch. After what felt like an eternity, the future finally appeared not as a burden to bear. It appeared to be something she could create. Yet, she soon discovered that hope rendered a woman vulnerable. The initial indication arrived with the arrival of Mrs. Hartley, the spouse of the preacher. Eloise caught the sound of the wagon's creak before it came into view, accompanied by the sharp neigh of a horse straining against the bit. With a swift motion, she cleaned her hands on her apron and made her way to the porch, timing her arrival perfectly as Mrs. Hartley made her descent, skirts sweeping across the dusty ground. "Good morning, Eloise," she said with an overly sweet tone. Eloise managed a courteous nod. Morning light filtered through the trees as Mrs. Hartley adjusted her bonnet, her gaze sweeping over the newly restored barn. The freshly cut timber outlines the porch, while the orderly stacks of supplies stand against the wall. Her smile was faint. "What a blessing you received," she remarked, her voice carefully modulated to convey judgment beneath a facade of compassion. "Perhaps it is," Eloise replied with measured thoughtfulness. Mrs. Hartley clicked her tongue in disapproval. "All of us held you in our thoughts, dear. There were whispers among us, a concern that you had strayed from the path of the Lord, seeking solace in the company of wayward men." The accusation, though cloaked, struck with a force more jarring than a slap. Eloise tensed. She understood the intricate workings of the town. Mercy served as a form of currency, exchanged solely when it aligned with the facade of propriety. Her gesture of kindness, her determination to prevent men from perishing at her threshold, had inexplicably rendered her a figure of doubt. "I did what was right," Eloise said, her voice unwavering. Mrs. Hartley's lips formed a tight line. "At times the way things seem holds equal weight to what we do. Surely you grasp that, don't you?" Eloise smiled then, a genuine smile, cutting as a blade. "It appears to me that the divine perceives beyond mere appearances." For a fleeting instant, the older woman's eyes sparkled with an emotion that could have been interpreted as anger or perhaps fear. In silence, Mrs. Hartley collected her skirts and ascended into the wagon, cracking the reins with an intensity that seemed excessive. As the wagon rattled into the distance, Eloise released a slow breath, the gravity of the encounter enveloping her. This was merely the outset. In the days that followed, minor acts of cruelty proliferated, much like the relentless spread of weeds. Mr. Delaney, the storekeeper, meticulously weighed her flour not once, but twice, and proceeded to charge her double. The blacksmith, typically warm-hearted, offered only a slight nod as she walked by. Once, children had waved at her, but now they averted their gazes, retreating beneath the piercing stares of their mothers. Eloise endured everything quietly. She had endured far greater challenges. Yet, in the stillness of the night, as she lay awake enveloped in darkness, the loneliness clawed at her, more piercing than any hushed murmur. At times, she found herself reflecting on Calder, pondering his whereabouts and whether he ever held her in his thoughts. She envisioned his unwavering hands mending her fence, the manner in which. His gaze grew tender as he absorbed her sorrow, offering no solutions, only presence. He had claimed he would come back, yet vows spoken beneath the vast expanse often found themselves consumed by the miles that lay between. One evening, as the sun painted the horizon with hues of crimson and gold, Eloise stood at the boundary of her fields, observing the gentle breeze dance through the parched grass. A wagon creaked along the far-off road, its presence a whisper in the stillness of the landscape. Once more she glimpsed the silhouette of Mrs. Hartley, her head held aloft, a gathering of townspeople arranged behind her. They offered no wave, nor did they cast even a fleeting glance in her direction. Eloise squared her shoulders, allowing the whispers to swirl around her, inviting their judgment. She refused to express regret for her kindness. She refused to entomb her heart in resentment merely to ease the discomfort of others. The dust storms had ravaged the land, leaving behind a harsh, unyielding terrain. Perhaps the moment had come for her to allow them to peel away her fear as well. As she pivoted to face the house once more, a whisper of sound reached her ears. Could it be the distant echo of hooves? Yet, as she gazed, all that met her eyes was the infinite expanse of the waiting fields. The days melded seamlessly, woven together by the threads of habit and quietude. Yet each evening, Eloise stood on the porch, her gaze traversing the horizon as the sun sank low, filled with anticipation and longing. And then, on a fateful night, he returned. It lacked any sense of drama. A silence enveloped the landscape, devoid of the thunderous gallop of hooves or any foreboding shout. Instead, a solitary figure emerged at the periphery of the fields, guiding his horse with a deliberate, unhurried pace toward her dwelling, the sunset casting a crimson hue in his wake. Calder Boone. Dust enveloped him, adhering like a second skin, while his hat was drawn low, casting shadows over his eyes. Yet, Eloise would have recognized him in any setting. Her heart raced within her chest as she descended from the porch, skirts swirling around her legs in the gentle evening breeze. She yearned to rush to him, to inquire about his prolonged absence, to insist on the truth behind the words he had left echoing in her mind. Yet, as he came to a halt mere feet from her, she noticed it. The fatigue etched into his shoulders, the darkness lingering beneath his eyes. He had embarked on a journey far beyond mere travel. He had been burdened by an unseen weight. In silence, Calder slipped from the saddle. He grasped the reins lightly in one hand, the other hanging at his side, caught in a moment of uncertainty about whether to draw closer to her or maintain his distance. "You returned," she murmured gently. He inclined his head, taking off his hat and cradling it against his heart. For a long moment they lingered in the twilight, the universe contracting to encompass just the two of them. At last, Calder shattered the stillness. "Trouble shadowing my every step," he murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper. Eloise frowned as if to say, "You should be aware of this. What sort of trouble are we talking about?" He averted his gaze toward the fading glow. "He mentioned it was back in Dry Creek. A crime was unjustly attributed to me. There exists an action I failed to undertake." He remained vague, withholding the sort of specifics one might expect from a man seeking to justify his actions. He presented it straightforwardly. "I ran," he said. "There wasn't a trial that deserved trust. The town sought a scapegoat. I belong." Eloise examined his face, the rigid contours etched into it, the scars cutting across his brow. She observed neither fear nor a hint of pleading, merely the subdued acceptance of a man accustomed to shouldering the weights imposed by others. With her arms crossed, she pondered deeply. "Do you feel remorse about running?" she inquired. Calder's jaw moved slightly, a muscle twitching in that spot. "No," he replied. "My only sorrow lies in parting from those who truly did not deserve to be left behind." The words lingered in the air, laden with unspoken truths. Silent words linger in the air. Eloise reflected on her own existence. The town had turned its back on her in the wake of Samuel's death. How the very individuals who once graced her porch with pies and flowers had now taken to crossing the street to steer clear of her. She understood the pain of being forsaken by those who ought to have remained loyal to her. She understood the essence of enduring it. "You're not the only one who's faced blame for just making it through," she murmured softly. Calder raised his eyes to hers, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable shimmering in those pale depths. "I can leave," he said, "if you want." The proposal was genuine, devoid of pride or resentment, a man offering her the opportunity he had never received. Eloise moved nearer, drawing in the scent of dust, sweat, and the well-worn leather that clung to him, near enough to observe how his fingers clenched the reins, reminiscent of a man preparing himself for denial. "No," she said, a single word that spanned the vast chasm separating them. Calder's face didn't betray relief, not in the conventional sense. Yet there was a subtle shift in his posture, as though an unnamed burden had lifted, if only slightly. Her fingers brushed against his sleeve, the coarse fabric radiating warmth beneath her touch. "You're not alone in your hauntings," she whispered. The wind danced around them, wafting the fragrance of soil and forgotten vows. After what seemed like an eternity, Eloise came to a profound realization. She was no longer merely existing, she was making choices. And this evening, her choice was him. 2 days later, the initial indication that trouble was on the horizon emerged. Eloise awoke at dawn, nurturing the sparse rows of beans that defiantly pushed through the parched, dust-laden soil. Calder worked diligently on the fractured wheel of the cart, his hands unwavering, his expression as inscrutable as always. The morning lay in stillness, an unsettling hush enveloping the world. Only when the distant sound of horses echoed over the rise did Eloise straighten, her hands brushing against the fabric of her apron. 5 riders drew near, their silhouettes sharp against the muted expanse of the sky. She identified them long before they drew near enough to exchange words. Mr. Delaney, the storekeeper, Reverend Hartley, and 3 other landowners from the west, men who had once clasped Samuel's hand and offered a comforting pat to Eloise after his funeral, now turned away when she needed them most. They approached with rigid postures and expressionless visages aligning themselves before her porch. Calder approached her with a silent grace, his presence both steadfast and unspoken. "Good morning, Eloise," Reverend Hartley said, taking off his hat yet refraining from a smile. Eloise inclined her head, her jaw clenching with resolve. "Good morning." The Reverend cleared his throat, casting a furtive glance at Calder before returning his focus to her. "We have gathered to discuss," he stated, "some pressing matters." Mr. Delaney adjusted his position in the saddle. "You've welcomed a fugitive into your midst, Eloise. The entire town is aware of it." Eloise sensed Calder's tension beside her, yet he remained silent. Without a glance in his direction, she sensed he was meticulously considering each possible escape, every danger, and all potential consequences. She advanced, her chin held high. "I welcomed a man in need of assistance," she remarked, "just as I would for anyone else." The Reverend's lips formed a narrow, unyielding line. "It transcends mere charity, Miss McCarty. It concerns safety, it concerns appearances. People are filled with apprehension, concern for their loved ones." The deception lingered unpleasantly in the air, reaching her senses from afar. This was not a matter of safety, it was a question of control, a tale of a woman who had yet to discover her rightful place, who refused to remain small and silent. "You want me to put him out," she said flatly, a murmur of agreement passing between the riders. "It's for your own good," Delaney insisted, "and for the good of the community." Eloise let out a laugh, a fragile sound that caught even her off guard. "For my own benefit," she reiterated. "Where was this support when my husband passed away and no one was there for me? Where was it that my roof leaked through 2 winters and no soul dared to cross?" Along that road the men shifted with a palpable discomfort. Reverend Hartley continued, his voice slick with insincere empathy. "There lies before you an opportunity, Eloise, to mend what has been broken and find your way back to the embrace of home." Eloise gazed beyond them, her eyes drifting to the desolate fields, to the fences that held her thoughts together, mended yet weary, to the barn that had narrowly escaped ruin, and to the delicate green shoots breaking through the parched earth, a testament that life, though scarred and weary, continued its relentless struggle for survival. She pivoted to face them, her voice a quiet yet resolute force. "I have a family now," she said. "It may not conform to your expectations. It may not find a place within the confines of your church pews or your store ledgers, but it belongs to me." The Reverend's expression grew stern. "You'll come to regret this," he remarked. As the town finally turned its back, Eloise smiled, and this time there was no bitterness in her expression. It was the smile of a woman who had endured the depths of loss and discovered her resilience in the aftermath. "Then let him," she remarked. One by one the riders pivoted their steeds, sending clouds of dust swirling as they withdrew. Not a single one cast a glance behind. Calder stood quietly beside her, their eyes following the men as they vanished beyond the hill. It was only after the dust had settled that he finally spoke, his voice as rough as gravel. "There was no need for you to take that action." Eloise faced him, her heart racing, caught in a whirlwind of fear and exhilaration all at once. "You didn't either," she remarked. "On that night you lingered, on that night you returned." Calder gazed at her for a moment, his expression chiseled and unyielding. Amidst shadows and secrets, there was an intensity so raw it left her breathless. In silence he extended his hand, deliberate and uncertain, gently sweeping a strand of wind-tossed hair away from her face. The caress was as delicate as a whisper, yet it resonated more profoundly than the most passionate embrace could have. They remained in that position for what felt like an eternity, a moment charged with tension. Two fractured spirits bravely clinging to the hope of becoming complete once more. As the wind surged once more, laden with the earthy aroma of dust and the whispers of far-off tempests, Eloise sensed that the worst was yet to come. Yet, she was aware of this as well. She would not confront it in solitude. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the warning arrived. A boy, slender and marked by dust, no more than 12 years of age, galloped swiftly on a mule, breathless to the point of struggle. "They are approaching," he breathed, clutching the ropes tightly. He then turned and fled, the mule stirring up clumps of parched soil as it vanished into the encroaching dusk. Eloise remained motionless on the porch, her heart pounding like a relentless hammer against her ribs. She needed no introduction to them. They were the town, the individuals who had concluded that compassion was an offense. Such mercy rendered a woman formidable. Calder moved next to her, his expression solidifying into a mask of unyielding stone. "How many?" he inquired. Eloise took a deep breath, her throat tightening as she swallowed. "That's sufficient." Both understood the implications of that moment. Calder sprang into action, swiftly saddling his horse, inspecting the rifle secured to the saddle, and ensuring that the few belongings worth saving were properly stowed away. He refrained from urging her to flee. He refrained from instructing her to conceal herself. He meticulously readied himself, as though being by her side was the singular decision that had ever held any clarity. Eloise shifted as well, collecting what she could, though her hands quivered with uncertainty. This territory, this stubborn bastion of hope, they would obliterate it, driven by their fears. With a flicker of resentment, she glanced at Calder, observing him as he meticulously tightened the saddle straps with measured, purposeful movements. "You should go," she said, her voice trembling. Calder stood tall, locking her with that unyielding gaze. "I'm not running," he declared. A knot formed in her throat. "I can't bear the thought of you getting hurt because of me," she whispered. A muscle twitched in Calder's jaw. He moved nearer, the warmth emanating from him palpable in the air between them. He spoke of past wounds. "I won't allow it to occur to you." Before she had the chance to respond, the rhythmic sound of hooves pierced the tranquil evening air. A dozen men or more emerged over the hill, lanterns swaying, guns shimmering in the dwindling light. They surged forward in a compact, furious mass, their expressions contorted with the conviction of those who thought that brutality could cleanse their sins. Eloise remained resolute on the porch, Calder at her side, his hand gently resting on the rifle at his hip, yet to lift it. A throng halted just a few paces from the dwelling. Reverend Hartley approached the forefront, a rope coiled casually in his gloved grasp. "You've been warned, Eloise," he called out. "Deliver him to me. We shall attend to what must be done, allowing you to return to your existence." A silence enveloped the landscape, interrupted solely by the mournful wail of the wind and the faint creaking of the barn doors swaying gently on their hinges. Eloise inhaled deeply, the dust swirling around her, a tangible reminder of the gravity of the moment pressing down on her very soul. She advanced with purpose. "I am living my life," she said, her voice echoing through the desolate expanse of the broken field. The expression on Reverend Hartley's face grew somber. "Do not act unwisely, my dear." Calder's fingers grazed hers, a fleeting touch just sufficient to bring her balance. "You'll have to go through me," Calder said then, his voice low yet resonant, cutting through the air like a gunshot. For an extended, tense moment, the mob lingered in uncertainty. They arrived with no anticipation of conflict. They arrived anticipating terror. Now, confronted by two figures standing resolutely side by side, a flicker of uncertainty dimmed their fervor. Mr. Delaney fidgeted uneasily in his saddle. One of the younger men at the rear shifted his horse ever so slightly, his mind racing with potential excuses to make his exit. Reverend Hartley cast a fierce glare. "You're making a mistake," he spat, his voice laced with disdain. Calder remained silent, Eloise remained silent. Yet they held their position firmly. In that stillness, the crowd unraveled. One by one, they shed their presence, murmuring curses, hurling saliva into the parched earth. Yet, they remained on the threshold, never stepping onto the porch. They lacked the courage. At last, the Reverend stood alone, the rope hanging idly from his grasp. He gazed upon them, the woman who had steadfastly rejected submission, and the man who had embraced loyalty in place of trepidation. For the first time, he appeared diminutive. He pivoted his horse in silence and vanished into the shadows. Eloise's shoulders drooped, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her in an instant. Calder grasped her elbow with a tender touch, providing her with stability. "Are you okay?" he inquired, his voice barely above a whisper. She gazed up at him, at the man who had opted to stand firm while countless others had chosen to turn their backs. After enduring a long, harsh season, Eloise finally permitted herself to embrace hope. She found herself in the embrace of companionship, a bond that would endure through time. In the days that ensued, the world did not transform overnight. The sky hung thick with dust. The fields lay cracked and unyielding, a testament to their defiance. The town continued to avert its gaze as Eloise arrived for her supplies. Yet, none of it held the same significance as it once did. Each evening, as Eloise returned home, there was Calder, repairing a fence, tending to a wound, wielding a tool, or carving something with a serene patience on the porch steps. For the first time in ages, the house no longer resembled a tomb. It seemed to herald a new chapter. Little was said about the events of that fateful night when the mob arrived. There are moments that transcend the need for language. The bond established in that confrontation was more potent than any apology or explanation could ever be. It was evident in the instinctive way Calder would grasp her hand as they traversed the fields side by side. It was evident in the manner Eloise poured 2 cups of coffee each morning, effortlessly anticipating his needs without a word of inquiry. Spring unfurled across the land with a hesitant grace, reminiscent of a wounded creature cautiously finding its footing. The seeds that Eloise had once doubted, the very ones she had nearly surrendered to despair, now began to emerge, slender green tendrils courageously breaking through the parched soil, life, bruised yet resilient. As twilight descended and the final glimmers of sunlight vanished beyond the hills, Calder paused in his task of oiling the saddle and made his way to her at the porch rail. For an extended period they remained in place, observing as the stars flickered into being one after another. At last, Calder mustered the courage to clear his throat.